It's been 10 years since I graduated from med school. 10 years! Yeah, that kind of means I'm getting old.
You are old.
And to commemorate the occasion, I figured I'd go down memory lane and think about the 10 fondest memories that I had from medical school. I don't know what everyone's perception of medical school is, if it's just hitting the books, going to the library, graduating and becoming a doctor, but there was so much more to med school that I want to share with all of you. Keep in mind, I started med school when I was 21 years old, and I finished when I was 25. So those were some of my first years as a full-fledged adult and still trying to find my way, still very naive. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of challenging, grueling, difficult moments in med school as well, but that's for a whole different video. If you want me to make a video on that, leave a comment in the comment section below, #engagement. But for real, I just want to keep this positive, because when I look back, I want to remember happy memories. For some context, I went to Columbia University for med school in New York City, but I also stayed there for residency for another 3 years. So I also need to take a moment to sort out which memories were from med school and which memories were from residency. So the first fond memory has to be my primary care rotation. So the way Columbia's med school is structured was after the first 2 years that were lecture-based, the third year was spent doing all of your required rotations. I started out with pediatrics, then went on to neurology and surgery and other required rotations, OBGYN. My last rotation of the year was my primary care rotation, and I had the great fortune of doing that in the Navajo Nation in SHIPROCK, New Mexico. And let me tell you, it was so cool. Hands down, the best 5 weeks of my med school experience. And aside from working in one of the Indian Health Service hospitals there, I think part of the reason why this option was available to some of us was to expand our horizons and really give us some insight into how the American healthcare experience differs tremendously depending on where you are in the country. I mean, some of the cool things that we got to do there were to take a Jeep out to people's homes in the middle of the desert and teach them how to cook healthy, but also understanding that cultural habits and customs and things that people are used to eating as part of their culture is sometimes very discordant from what we recommend as to what healthy eating is. But I had a great time interacting with the locals there. I remember doing this sweat lodge thing, going to Zumba classes with the locals, eating mutton stew and fry bread, and exploring the surroundings. So we were encouraged to take every Wednesday and Friday afternoon off and explore the surroundings. They told us, don't come to the hospital, but do something and report back to us what exactly you did. So we spent time going to the Grand Canyon in Arizona, going to Arches National Park in Utah, Telluride, and Mesa Verde in Colorado. It was just so beautiful and so fulfilling to be able to see that part of the country and again remind us that this is also part of the American experience. These are Americans who experience healthcare and experience their day-to-day very differently than what I had previously been exposed to in New York. Number 2 is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I'm not just talking about the museum itself in New York City, but it was actually built into our curriculum, which I thought was really cool. So along the same lines of broadening our horizons and exposing us to culture, I think that part of the goal at Columbia, which I'm really grateful for, is building a well-rounded doctor. So for an entire semester, I had to go to the Metropolitan Museum, the Met, once a week with a group of classmates, and we would take this tour with a tour guide of the museum, observe certain paintings, talk about the paintings, sit down and sketch, and I think it was all to kind of hone our observational skills and quite literally just take us away from med school for a moment and keep our mental health in check, let us do something different, make sure that we're well-rounded individuals. And that was just super fun. And although in the moment it was a little annoying to be like, oh, I have to put all my schoolwork down and take time to go across town and go to the museum to sit around for a bit, in retrospect, I'm so glad that I was able to do that. And other classmates of mine who didn't go to the museum once a week for an entire semester were in other types of classes like photography or yoga or meditation or stuff like that. So I'm really glad that I had that experience. Number 3 is exploring New York City with some of my friends and classmates. And look, I know that I'm incredibly privileged to be able to have enjoyed as much as I did in New York City because New York is expensive and not everyone wants to go to New York or can afford to go to med school in New York for that reason. And it was a really unique experience going to med school in New York. I think because med school is so busy and you have very little time to enjoy things, having so much at your disposal, just walking out the door any day of the week, knowing that there's always something to do, something cool that's happening in the city was super, super key. And to the best of my ability, I tried to explore as much as I could. I went to Broadway shows, I explored restaurants, both hole-in-the-wall restaurants, Michelin star restaurants. I remember even going down this whole rabbit hole of trying to figure out which place in New York City had the best cupcake. So I went to all the different cupcake places. I even went to TV show tapings, The Daily Show, Stephen Colbert, Rachel Ray, The View, Conan O'Brien, and the museums. Oh my God, there's so many great museums. I mean, I talked about the Met, but I'm a big fan of museums, and New York had plenty of them. But even the little moments, I mean, thinking about like meeting up with friends and walking down the street, those are some of the most cherished memories from med school. And yes, you have time to do that. Number 4 is orientation. Oh my gosh. I mean, I thought that orientation was just a whole lot of fun, which is why I want to put it on this list. We went to Coney Island as a class, and there are a lot of locals in my med school class, so they were able to show us around, and I remember going to this Russian cafe. But I think part of it was just being able to walk into this community, this class of 160 or so friends, all apprehensive and scared about med school, quite honestly. And for me, I think it was a really pivotal moment in taking a step forward in adulthood, because I went to college in North Carolina at Duke, and I was itching to leave North Carolina once I was done, and super excited to move to a big city, but at the same time terrified, because I always thought of New York as this big, menacing place, overwhelming in so many ways. So I was scared, and I was kind of sheltered too. So orientation was one of those first moments in med school where I knew that I was going to be okay. Number 5 is the SIMS program, and I'm not talking about the video game. I'm talking about the Summer Institute for Medical Students, I think, which is part of the Betty Ford Center. I don't know if it's still called the Betty Ford Center, but it's basically this rehab program / facility in California, I think around Palm Springs, where I think a lot of celebrities and well-known people actually go there for addiction disorders. But when I first heard about this opportunity to spend a week there, between my first and second year of med school, I believe, I was super interested. So several of us med students from around the country spent a week at this center, and we weren't just there observing, we were actually integrated into the treatment program, participating in the small group discussions with people recovering from addiction and substance abuse. We were also there to participate in the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and the Al-Anon meetings, which is specifically for loved ones and relatives of those who are going through the treatment program. We were also introduced to some really high-functioning physicians and other professionals who were patients at that treatment center. It did change my perception a bit of what addiction looks like, and not to say that addiction only looks like that, because it's still a very skewed view of what recovery is like, because from my understanding, not everyone has access to a facility like that. I remember some of the patients there were actually part of this commuter program where they would live together in this monitored housing, this cul-de-sac. We were invited to one of their homes. One of the patients happened to be a professional chef, I believe, and cooked a phenomenal meal for us and talked about their story. And I don't have any photos from that experience because obviously patient privacy, but I have some fun photos from when us group of med students would hang out and go out on the town. Number 6 is chamber music. I always thought before going to med school that when I went to med school, it was only going to be studying and that there wouldn't be any extracurricular activities. But at Columbia, there was this whole host of different clubs, and not just like professional interest groups, but also clubs devoted to theater and devoted to music and the arts and sports. And I was in the chamber music group called the Musicians Guild, and there would be monthly recitals, and I would perform sometimes with as a soloist or with other classmates, and there was just so much musical talent in our class. And I think that there's a YouTube video floating around somewhere from a decade ago. This was something that I think really helped center me and distract me a little bit so that I wasn't just spending all my time studying. And up until that point, especially through high school, part of the goal of playing the violin, I think, was grooming me to participate in competitions and doing things like that and really playing to perfection. But that group, being in that chamber music group, was more about just like having a good time together and collaborating. It didn't have to be perfect as long as we were having fun. Number 7 is, I mean, I think this goes without saying, but friends and classmates. I loved how so many of my classmates came from so many different walks of life. A lot of my classmates took time off before med school, worked in other disciplines. There was an acclaimed author in my class. There were athletes in my class. There were people who worked in finance on Wall Street before changing careers and going to medical school. And I think that's what made my med school class super interesting. And I think Columbia also had a thing for attracting people who wanted to live in New York City, who were adventurous and young and wanted to experience the city to its fullest extent. It made for a really, really great group of people. Number 8 is my ICU rotation. And yes, it took me this long to actually mention something actually clinical. My ICU rotation was my first rotation of 4th year med school when I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And at that time, I thought that maybe I'd want to become a critical care doctor, which if I'd gone down that path would have made life very different this past year through the pandemic. The ICU is just such a unique place because it's so high stress. You have to be so detail oriented. Every few days I was up for 30 hours until the next day and barely awake, but it was so formative and just such a period of growth. And I don't know how to describe it, but it was also one of those rotations where you kind of synthesize all of your knowledge that you've learned to care for the patient in their most dire situation. I mean, these are the sickest patients in the hospital. So, you know, as tough as it was in the ICU, intensive care unit, it was just also one of the most exhilarating, gratifying, and just fulfilling experiences, honestly. Number 9 was my anatomy lab. And I'm not talking specifically about the experience of examining a cadaver because that's sometimes really heavy, but I was thrown into this my first year of med school and we were required to work as a team, the 6 of us, and I had heard all these horror stories about how people in the anatomy lab were very competitive and not willing to allow each other to dissect certain portions. And I just had such a great experience with my anatomy lab and my classmates. Everyone was so nice, and I think it made for a great introduction into what collaboration could look like in medicine, because often I think it gets a bad rap. I think that people think of medical students as really competitive and trying to step on one another to excel, but yeah, that wasn't the case with my anatomy group, and I think we all did really well as a result because we were supportive of one another. And the last thing in the 10 fondest moments, ironically, is studying. And I'm not gonna say studying like the act of studying, but just studying in different places, and I think that's what I did to try to vary things up. I'm not somebody who I think studies well at home, so I would study in the library, I would study in different parts of the medical center buildings, and because part of the med school library was under construction, I was also forced to go to the undergrad campus 50 blocks south. Sometimes when I think back to studying, I don't remember like the text in the textbook or the slides on the printout, but I just think about like the experience of asking my classmates questions and trying to figure certain things out together, or even like the muffins that I'd buy every day, or the Indian food that we'd order because we were studying all together as a group in the night. And you know, some of my closest friends, we actually made it a point to study in a small group together and kind of like study hard and play hard. So sometimes we would go to each other's places and study a few, quiz each other, and then watch a movie or play video games or do something fun together. And I mean, to this day, I don't know what my best studying style is, but I really enjoyed that part of studying in retrospect. Not necessarily the studying itself though. And I know this is like meaningless to most people, but I still remember going up to the 17th floor of one of the buildings and having this little study space that had a view looking south down Manhattan, seeing the Empire State Building. At the time, One World Trade Center wasn't done construction yet, but looking down Manhattan like that and often seeing the sunset, it was just beautiful. And from what I understand, that part of the building is no longer a study space, so I don't think any of the med students there can experience it anymore. So yeah, I mean, looking back, I think I really made the most of med school. I think the unifying theme here is that Med school wasn't just about studying and just about books, but there was just so much more that I did and was able to do. And it goes to show that med school doesn't have to just be sitting there in a library with your head buried in books. You know, anyone watching this, if you think about when you were in your early 20s, those were some of the most influential years of my life. And being able to spend that in New York was truly a privilege. I'm so glad that I'm not as naive as I was before, that I did all the things that I did then, because now it's becoming increasingly difficult at times to do some of those things, both time-wise and physically. The amount of time and money and tuition that it takes to become a doctor aside, that specific 4-year span of going to medical school and everything that I experienced then was totally worth it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions, please leave them in the comment section below. If you want to see a whole nother video about the challenges that I had in med school, maybe I'll make one of those videos sometime in the future. And again, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It would really help me out. And if you want to see more from me, subscribe or not. I mean, you're already here. Anyway, thanks for hearing me out. I can't believe it's been 10 years. I still feel like I'm in my early 20s and maybe sometimes act like I am in my early 20s. And some people would say that I look like I'm in my early 20s, but I don't know. But anyway, thanks again. I'll see you in my next video. Stay healthy. Bye.